There's an age-old expression that things come in threes. It seems to be the only piece of wisdom politicians know these days. No matter what the question or challenge, there are always three parts to the answer. It feels as if it has been honed to perfection, as what used to be three phrases becomes refined down to just three words, divorced from any meaningful context. Those three-word phrases roll off the tongue in the hope of becoming deeply memorable, but of course in the absence of context, allowing an almost infinite variety of interpretations when called to account. We might decry this trend of turning our lives into pithy statements riddled with ambiguity, but we do need a little caution. Our faith too is often condensed into pithy phrases which convey so much meaning to those steeped in the context from which they are drawn. Which Christian doesn't draw from time to time on John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only son. One of those other familiar phrases is drawn from chapter 6 of the prophet Micah. What does the Lord require of you but to act justly, to love mercy and walk humbly with your God? In this case, it truly is one of those three-part truths. Act justly, love mercy, walk humbly with God. Make sure everything you do is done with fairness, without prejudice, and with integrity. That's about your impact on others, setting an example of what is good and right. Make sure that you're open to receive the undeserved mercy, grace, and forgiveness from God. Don't endanger your own sense of worth by refusing to receive kindness and love from others. And make sure that your achievements don't go to your head, and that in humility you dedicate those successes to the value of journeying through life with God as your constant guide and companion. Three characteristics which mark out a person as living in faith and truth with God. As Micah states, this is all God asks of you. Act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with God. The simplicity of this statement almost masks its true depth when it comes to following these precepts and living out those characteristics. Nothing watered down or left too ambiguous in that little threesome. I'm sure it's with that in mind that the Methodist Church began its 2-year journey of exploration and discernment about its future strategy under the heading Walking with Micah. The Church has spent the last 2 years under this banner of Walking with Micah, seeking to rediscover a sense of calling and purpose, and particularly seeking to understand what it means to take the first of these statements seriously. What does it mean to act justly? Indeed, that question has been sharpened along the way. What does it mean to be a justice-seeking church? If we are to obey what the prophet tells us, then in this world in which we seem to be bombarded from all sides by injustice, what are we going to do differently? How are we as a church going to behave differently in order to restore justice to the centre stage of our thoughts and our deeds? How are we going to stand out in this world in which injustice is the most obvious characteristic around? Knowing the significance of the Walking with Micah project, I was keen to seek out how the work was going to be shared with conference and how the ensuing discussions might shape the future of the church. Was it going to be all-encompassing? How might it impact on local churches? Or might it simply pass us by? Armed with those thoughts, I turned to the agenda and papers going to the annual conference in June. Remember, this is in effect the governing body of the church, providing oversight, direction and accountability for the church. At first glance, I was disappointed to scan through the agenda to discover that there were 52 items on the agenda. The vast majority, the humdrum but essential activities of keeping the organisation ticking over. Walking with Micah was the only agenda item which jumped out as looking forward to the very purpose of our ministry, as distinct from just keeping the ship afloat. I probably missed a couple of others, but that was the one that jumped out at me. Seeing that imbalance, made me realise just how easily we get drawn into the mundane of the status quo, just maintaining an even keel. Then I realised just how much of our own church's activity is about everyday stuff, how easily the everyday tasks consume all our energy and activity. It was a salutary reminder that we're not just keeping yet another organisation floating along. We are called to live out our lives by acting justly, loving mercy and walking humbly with God. So as I turned to the report challenging us to do precisely that, I was pleased to see that it isn't offering another talking shop and yet more policy stuff to absorb into day-to-day running of the church. It's actually calling on us to refocus on what it means to be a justice-seeking church. This is not passive, it's active. It gives clarity and purpose to our calling to be justice-seeking in all our dimensions. The report calls us, it actually demands from us to seek out those places where justice is lacking. As churches, we need to find the space to understand what God places before us, how we mobilise in His name, and as the conference declared, understand what it means to be a justice-seeking church. Not a cosy club or a place to meet our friends, but a place in which we are challenged and inspired and motivated to demand a more just and loving world, just as God demands of us. The report helpfully sets out 6 principles for justice based on our understanding of God's own stance on justice. Firstly, in the image of God, each is worthy of equal value and dignity. Justice demands that we confront racism and sexism and challenge division and polarisation of society, which always seeks out the different to pick on and marginalise and humiliate them. The fear of those in power manifest in this injustice. Dignity and respect and equality is for all. Secondly, the flourishing of creation and human community. This is not just about survival or ticking along or keeping your head down. This is about flourishing, being energised and ambitious and fulfilled, looking after creation and the environment, doing all we can to accelerate the move to net zero carbon, but doing that in a way which gives everyone a sense of place and purpose, bringing cohesion and belonging, not being driven by profit and greed, but caring for each other. Thirdly, God consistently shows a bias to the poor and excluded. This is not just about caring for the poor and marginalised. This is about going out of our way to help them to flourish, not with patronising handouts, but with dignity and respect, and with a willingness to pay the price and disadvantage ourselves in order that they can rise up the ladder. The fourth one is particularly profound for leaders. Those in power have a special responsibility for upholding justice, if only. It's a really tough message for leaders and decision makers. With their privilege comes even more responsibility for honour and integrity and being the first to lead the way in what's right. It means for us recognising when we are in those roles of leadership and power, but also recognising when we have to hold others to account for their special response to their privilege. The fifth one, all people and nations to work for peace and justice and liberation and transformation. Not about the status quo, it's about bringing meaningful peace and justice and liberation. Again, if only. There is so much hard battle to be done to stand for peace and justice, and we need to speak out for it. And the final one is perhaps the most important of them all. Live in hope, but not just simply live in hope, which we've been saying for a long time, associated with the climate change and everything else. Hopefulness is so important, but what the Walking with Micah report says is living hope in ways that reflect God's character. God is a God of hope. Look at look at the stories of his response to creation. Look at his ambition. Look at his appetite and his desire for people to love and care for his creation. Live in hope in ways that truly reflect God's character. Not only to hold on to hope ourselves and live out our lives in hopefulness, but to reflect the very nature of our hopeful God in the way we do this. In that reading from Luke's Gospel, as Jesus challenged the Pharisee in the reading, he was critical of the talk of justice and faith, which was at cross purposes with their practical action and their continued injustice to the needy. This is part of what we are being called to recognise in ourselves, in our lives, and change. I see the power and burning ambition of God's nature set out in these 6 principles, and I see the accompanying dangers of an apathy and a tiredness and lack of agency to believe and act in a way that makes these things possible. In a sense, our lack of hopefulness, our lack of willingness to move, our contentedness with where we are, is the enemy of God's burning ambition for justice-seeking church. So my challenge to you as individuals, as church community, is to fire up that spirit and to take ownership of God's demand to be an active, justice-seeking community. Amen. And may God bless us as we strive in our own lives and in those around us to seek that justice and way of peace and way of equality and way of fulfilment and purpose for everyone around. Amen.